in Twice Lived, I feel like it is a coming of age story for not just the girls, but for their parents as well, because you're consistently coming of age. It's just always different things that concern you at each age, and it's something that I'm feeling like at the moment in my like late 30s. I'm really feeling like a new sort of beginning again.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
You forgot. You lived. You almost let yourself be fine before you remembered what was at stake. And then when you notice, it's like having 1,000 holes drilled right through you because she's gone.
That's like the most intense tagline I think we've ever had.
It may very well be.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm Sean.
I'm Daniel.
And today we're joined...
Sorry, yeah.
That's the person. We're joined by Joma West, a third culture writer and editor whose work straddles both fantasy and science fiction. Her first book, the novella Wild, won the Manchester Metropolitan University Novella Award. It's actually a mouthful to say. And her novels Face and Twice Lived were published by Tor.com in 2022 and this year, respectively. And we're going to be chatting about Twice Lived primarily here, but we'll probably ask many questions about the work in general. So welcome to the show, Joma.
Hi. Yeah. Nice to be here.
This is great. Well, okay. So let's see. So, oh no, this is Daniel's part. I will shut up. No, it's Daniel. You're the next part of the script. I am a professional.
So before we get into our discussion, a reminder to our listeners, please share your questions and comments with us about our show at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. They might get discussed right here on future shows, and if you haven't already, join us on Twitch for Sean's Alphabet streams, Fridays at 6:30 p.m. Central, to be a part of our interactive live streaming format. Finally, be sure to join our Patreon and be part of our special Patreon-only events on Discord. It only takes $1 a month.
Great. So the only other thing to note is do let folks know about the show. If you liked an episode, share it on your social medias, because that's also good for the authors we have on too, because then more eyeballs on their books, and then buy all their books. And then buy more copies and like give them out on street corners. It helps.
Yeah,
It really does.
So it really does help. Yeah. Also, free books. Who wouldn't be for that? Right?
Yep.
I wish that was the culture we had. You just wander in a street corner and someone just hands you a book.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the dream.
That is the dream society. Maybe we need to write that book.
I do that from time to time. I have too many books, or so my wife says.
It's no such thing. Yeah.
My wife says the same thing. Too many books. Yes. You need to get rid of your books. It hurts. It hurts me.
It hurts.
So, Joma, you have this latest novel, Twice Lived, and I was hoping you could start by telling us a little bit about this particular book.
Yeah, I still haven't perfected a kind of pitch for it. I'm not very good at explaining it. So it's about these two girls that share a body, and they have different lives, different families, and they shift between those two worlds. And after a long time of shifting, they've found out that only one of them can survive. So it's really about who gets to live, who gets to have that body, who gets to keep their family, I think.
That's a decent, that's a decent accounting.
That sounds accurate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I actually ask, before we talk about the book specifically, could I ask something about your bio? Because there was a term that came up that I suspect a lot of people are not familiar with, which is third culture.
Yeah.
Which I suspect most people have, or at least some of the people listening to the show maybe haven't heard that before. And I figured since that describes you could maybe explain, what does that actually mean for folks?
So my mother is Kenyan Indian and my father is English. So two different cultures there. I'm biracial, but I grew up in different countries in Africa. So third culture is when you have you sort of grow up in an environment that doesn't belong to either of your family's culture. So yeah, so I was bouncing around a lot. And actually, I mean, looking at Twice Lived, you can see that's kind of an elegant metaphor for being third culture in a lot of ways.
I was thinking that exact thing when I was like, wait,
Mhm.
this book might a little bit
Yeah,
because that
I only really
yeah.
thought about that after I'd written it, though. It wasn't necessarily
Interesting.
a pointed thing that I wanted to write about.
That is
So
interesting. So
where
like your subconscious maybe
Hmm.
got involved there, or
Mhm.
or at the very least people are going to interpret it, I suppose, that
Yeah.
way. So yeah.
Mhm. And that plays into Face as well to some
Mhm.
degree in terms of separation and sort of separation of people, kind of like trying to find home, trying to find a
Mhm.
place. But before we get more into that, I guess, where did Twice Live begin then
Um,
in terms of a concept?
I had been working on a completely different book with a character called Canna Lily in it. And she had a little sister called Loretta and a mother called Cynthia. And I'd planned out this story a little bit. But it was a very, very different kind of fantasy vibe. And she wasn't the main character, even though I was trying to, well, I'd started with her being the main character in mind, but this other character had come in, sort of taken over the narrative. And I realized I wasn't particularly interested in telling his story. I wanted to tell hers. So it was at that point where I was like, the story is just not working. I can't finish it. So I was just lying in bed thinking about, I need another idea, I need another idea, and I need one soon as well. And it literally just came then. I think I'd written a short story several years previous that had that kind of idea of shifting as well. And Canna and Lily being two separate characters instead of just one was just kind of a nice way to marry those ideas together. And it really did just come from sitting there going, think of an idea.
I do like that in both of these works the you're doing this thing that so much science fiction or genre, even fantasy to a degree as well, has done historically just in its own way, which is like you take this concept, some specific thing that's different. Sometimes this is like referred to as the novum in like academic parlance, which you may or may not appreciate depending on your interest.
Always do.
And then you just kind of tease it out, right? Where you just take that and then think about all of the ways it impacts the work. And it made me think that to some degree, a lot of your work is engaged in that mode that we sometimes refer to as like social science fiction, thinking
Mm-hmm.
like Le Guin and Butler and Hopkinson to a degree as well. And I'm kind of curious, is that how you would describe your approach to genre, as more of a socially infused, thinking about the societal impacts of whatever the change is?
Yeah, very much. I mean, you hit it with Le Guin as well, was like a huge influence on me. That sort of what if moment. And I think I've started to describe it as kitchen sink sci-fi, which is just very domestic in a sense, just looking at the sort of little interactions that make us people, but in a sort of slightly uncomfortable, kind of twisted reality, just to sort of see if you can really dig deep and see what you think a person would do if you're just like us, but in that situation. So it helps you sort of analyze who people are now, I guess. That's what I'm interested in, at least.
Oh, that's great, because my other question is actually about this very thing too. Because I listened to the audiobook of Twice Lived,
Mhm.
and I don't know how much the audiobook colored my interpretation of the work, but it felt like a deeply personal approach. Not personal as in like you personally, although it might have been, but like the focus on the kind of almost like you say kitchen sink, I was thinking like mundane everyday aspects of life, like going to a club or like going to school or just how you feel. And there seemed to be a lot of deep interest in the internal impacts for characters, not just like society at
Mhm.
large, but more personalized. And I guess I'm kind of curious. You've kind of already hinted at this, but what particularly do you find compelling about that sort of very small scale personalized approach in writing in genre or any fiction for that matter?
Um, I think that, well, I guess I feel like I'm not particularly qualified to look at bigger changes in a sense, whereas I am like someone who likes to observe people. So I tend to observe those minutiae, and that's what I'm familiar with. And from there, I feel like you can focus in on small things, and then the story, like whoever's reading it, can then extrapolate bigger ideas and impacts from that, um, because everything starts on the micro and it gets bigger. So I guess that's where I'm most interested. I think that's where a lot of people have been frustrated with, say, Face or Twice Lived, is we've got these like sort of scenarios, these worlds, and people will expect like someone to, I don't know, break down the system in Face that's not very positive for people, or they'll expect us to sort of solve shifting and figure out a way that things can be happier for everyone. And those are the stories that people expect from those kinds of I guess what if scenarios, but that's never been what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in the realism of that, which is that it's really hard to affect change. And people are just going to be people, very concerned with themselves, no matter what else is going on around them. And I sort of want to speak to that. And I would like people to see echoes of themselves in that. But I guess when you're showing them, like, say, in Face, everyone's kind of nasty. You don't really want to see yourself like that. So, but that's what I'm interested in, is sort of digging into what makes us us.
And to some degree, also, there is an element of like exploring how people learn to live with sometimes very uncomfortable change,
Yeah.
which in the case of Twice Lived, right? I mean, the opening chapter is kind of terrifying. If I were, a person who could get pregnant, that would be terrifying to have like my baby inside me disappear. Like, and then, that, so there is something about like learning to live with these big changes, and the fact that like you can't just wish it away. You do have to learn to live. I don't know if
and the randomness of it all.
Yeah, I know that's in the synopsis, which I also that was very interesting, because it seemed like the randomness is both learning to live with the kind of micro small changes, but also the big life changes that affect people as well, and like dealing with scary things that can happen to you, and how do we get through that as humans. Which,
yeah,
I don't know if you had any thought on that, but that's how I felt reading this Twice Lived and Face to some degree. Yeah,
that's really nice to hear. I think for me, it's very difficult to really understand what it's like to come at it as a reader. And it's been quite a long time since I've written Twice Lived as well, so it feels like quite a distant country from me now. So talking about it, I sometimes feel like I don't know what I'm talking about even. Like, for instance, you made that quote at the beginning, Daniel, and I totally forgot that I'd written that.
Okay. I'm the same way with things I write or details like that, so I empathize and understand
that. That sounds familiar.
That sounds good. Yes.
I just interviewed Daniel actually about, because he's a microbiologist by trade, and I was asking him about a paper he had written, like probably it was written and published like 4 years ago, but it probably was written even before that. It's like, well, how much does he really remember?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough task.
So you've mentioned, starting with going from the micro to the macro, and in some ways that's how you're approaching the themes in your story, exploring the characters, the sort of genesis of the idea from something small, and then extrapolating to how it might affect individuals and their lives and the interconnectedness of their lives. I guess I have two kind of related questions from that concept. One is, how do you then formulate the sort of rules by which this works, your scenarios that you set up, whether it be in Face or in Twice Lived, of like shifting the rules for how it works? How do you communicate that and get the audience, the readers, on board with it? So that's the first one. The other one I can hold on to and ask about afterwards.
That's a gnarly question.
Sorry.
So I'm very much one of those people that I don't really like planning things when I start writing. So I just dive straight in, and as things are going, I often talk out loud, usually to my husband, about ideas that are going on. And I don't really require any feedback. I'll just be talking, and I'll start to figure out, oh, well, that's not working because this needs to. Okay, and I'll start to figure out the rules mentally, but I won't necessarily write them down. So they're always just sort of like there in my head as I'm working. And I don't really like giving readers very much. That's probably what most of my beta readers, my agent complains about, is that I expect readers to be inside my head. With my work, it's always editing is always people asking me to add sections. So things come in later. It's like, this isn't clear. You need to add this, or could you maybe come up with a scene that might help explain that? So that's sort of how I try. Well, that's how it builds to making it understandable, I guess, for a reader. But I very much start bare bones, keep it as lean as possible. Yeah, anorexic.
That's that's fascinating to me somewhat, and not totally surprising, but somewhat, in terms of then my follow-up to that was that there's also a structure that you build to the way the novel's written, in terms of, I guess the term I would use is weaving together fragments. There's fragments of both the story, you have shifting worlds that are occurring in Twice Lived, you have, and shifting characters, you have sort of very different points of view in Face, including some repeating narratives that you just get from another character's perspective now. And all of that gets weaved together into what seems to be a very complex but sturdy structure. But that all just happens organically, you're saying? Like, as you're, and then in the editing process kind of...
Yeah, pretty much.
Refined, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say most of it happens organically. But I spend so much time thinking about it. Like, I don't actually spend that much time on the writing. It's just a lot of the time just sitting and thinking. So it's always there. It's always fresh. I think sometimes people underestimate how much you're doing when you're not actually doing the work, you know? But
just the thought process.
Yeah. Like I get very obsessed with my stories. So yeah, they'll be constantly going around in my head.
I want to ask a semi-related craft question, because I asked the same question of John Wiswell, and I'm curious of your perspective on this. You've written 2 novels. That's a lot of writing. And you're still going, because I'm sure there's another one. We'll find out. There's more stuff coming later. But I'm kind of curious. How do you keep writing? Like, we hear writers talking about being really stressed out and burnt out and exhausted, and the world is a nightmare zone, and life and jobs and all of these things. How do you find that energy to write, I guess, like that, so that you're not overwhelmed by the world, essentially? Where does that come from for you?
That's a good question. I mean, I've been writing since I was quite young. I think I wrote my first novel when I was 15, and it was very bad. But I did get an agent at the time, and I mean, I got dropped very quickly because I couldn't sell it. But you know, like it was a dream that started quite early, and so I've given up several times, but quite young, where I was like, nah, I can't handle it. I can't do it anymore. Life is too complicated. But you know, when you love to write, that's something you always go back to eventually. So it kept on coming back, and I knew it was something that I had to do. So you get to a certain point where you're like, well, that is my job now. I am a writer. And then I knew that was the only thing I really wanted to do. So then it was working out what else I could let go of in my life to prioritize that. So I've been very privileged. I've managed to give up almost all of my day jobs. And so now I very much am the work-life balance very skews to life. And so I have a lot of space for writing. And because of that, I don't really get burnout that much. And in the burnout times, the writing's going on in the head where I'm trying to work through those problems, not necessarily at the forefront, but definitely in the subconscious. So yeah, I think I've learned not to worry when I'm hitting a wall. And it's like, oh, it's just a wall. That will disappear at some point. I just need to sort of let it go for a bit. And in those times, I just like to fill myself with other people's good art. So watching movies, TV shows, reading books, just consuming as many different kinds of other stories as possible, because I get so much inspiration from what other people do.
I think that's very useful to think about. Like, walls are going to happen, but just remember that they're not permanent. They're made out of sandstone, not concrete.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it
That's
gets
great.
you
That's great.
down for sure. But like at the moment, I'm going through a really nice writing period where I'm just really, really hyper about getting to work every day. I'm really excited. So yeah, you just have to remember that there are days like that. And so when it's looking a bit impossible, that's just around the corner.
I do like
And
that.
it's nice that you're able to shift maybe to another aspect then of the process in those
Yeah, yeah,
moments.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think it'd be helpful for,
It's
aspiring writers to actually hear, published writers saying, "Oh no, I get those moments too." And you can get through them.
It's also, I think that writers often have a lot of guilt with sitting around and not doing the work. And you know what? Some days you just want to sit around in your boxes watching cartoons and eating ice cream out of a tub, and that's fine. Um, like,
No
I feel
comment.
like that should be normal for people. They should be like, this is an okay thing. This is okay. Don't beat myself up about that. That's a really nice way to spend a day or a week or a month.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's great. Yeah,
yeah,
taking
that's
some of
good.
that guilt out of it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, I need to do that more for myself, I think.
Now
Sorry.
with
Yeah, please,
Face,
Daniel.
no, that's okay. With Face, you that was sort of like the first foray into traditional big time publishing, I guess I would
Yeah.
say. And that whole experience for you, how did that compare, I guess, then to the second time around of writing Twice Lived? I mean, maybe you even wrote Twice Lived before all that was done, but writing Twice Lived and going through publishing a second time, was it easier, less surprises, more familiar?
It was, I think, for me, more nerve-wracking, more depressing, sadder. um,
Oh no.
uh, Writing Twice Lived, I definitely had a lot of like second album worries, and also because it's such a different book from Face. And so I was like, the people that liked Face might not enjoy this because it's such a different vibe. And yeah, and there was just that uncertainty. I'd never written anything with such soft characters before. I tend to prefer to write spiky, difficult, irritating, unlikable people. So that kind of softness felt like a vulnerability that I was demonstrating myself as a writer. And so that was nerve-wracking. The fact that I liked them, hoping that other people would as well, and just knowing it was working. I just constantly was beset by doubts about the quality of the work. And even when people were telling me it was good, I was like, do you know what you're talking about? I know you're a professional, but do you know? So yeah, I was very nervous about it. And the editing process was so much less involved on Twice Lived, which made me worry even more. With Face, I was getting a lot of notes back and things that I could add and things that I could change, which really made me feel like I was an active participant in the publishing. Whereas with Twice Lived, it very much felt like I sent it off and then I waited for like ever to find out anything. And then it was just like, oh, yeah, no, we've got a cover for you and we're sorting this out and that out. So I really didn't feel like I was very much part of that journey that much, because there was just very little to report, I guess. And that's nerve-wracking in itself because you've given out your baby and you just don't know what's happened to it. And then suddenly the publishing date comes up and you haven't prepared anything because what is there to do? So yeah, for me, it was kind of
Right.
like a more quiet and lonely process with Twice Lived.
Giving up your baby and not knowing what's happening to it,
Yeah.
that's kind of, I guess, an apt parallel then to the actual novel.
Yes, I didn't really think about that.
So it all works, right?
Well, that is actually a great segue then to something I did kind of want to ask about Twice Lived, because that is a huge part of this work is her mother throughout the book, like, is having these experiences of like, what is this other family like? And like, there's even this really sad moment that I thought was interesting because it parallels what happens with quote unquote regular families that don't have this shifting problem, which is every once in a while a kid would just say how much they like hate their parents, like because they got disciplined or something. It probably happens to every parent at some point. But that has very different implications when they actually have another family they spend time with.
Hmm.
Where like I like my other family more. That felt like a thing that like it seemed like you were really exploring those ways that we try to relate to children, to our own kids, and that can be a very difficult and fraught process. And then taking that to sort of the extreme of all of the complications in that parental child relationship, especially as they grow and become independent, shifting perhaps is almost thinking in terms of like a metaphor for that growth of independence, except it's taking place throughout the entire process. And I was kind of curious about when you were writing this work and exploring that parent child relationship in this context, how you kind of saw yourself really tackling the complexities of parenthood, being a child of a parent, those very difficult and complicated human psychologies, I guess,
Mm.
which I think you definitely really explore in very interesting ways here.
I was definitely worried about it, especially from the mother's points of view, because I'm not a parent and I have no intention of ever becoming one. So yeah, so it's an experience that's completely beyond me. I can't really understand what it's like to have that unconditional uh, link to another being like that. All I can do is see it from the perspective of being the child. So it was very easy for me to sink into like Hannah and Lily's voices. And I kind of knew the kinds of things that I might say in those situations, perhaps. I mean, they're very different from me, but there are things that you hear children say. I've got nieces and a nephew as well, and I used to teach kids as well. So there are certain things you hear, and I guess I was just trying to imagine what it would be like if someone said those things to me. But I still feel kind of tentative to talk about the mothering experience because I haven't had it. So I was kind of on tenterhooks to see what parents might say, and no one's really said anything about the parent aspect of it. I think people are very much focused on the girls, and the sort of discourse is veered towards kind of talking about it being YA, I guess, which isn't how I wrote it. I wrote it very much as a sort of adult novel that has young characters in it. But yeah, so the focus has really been on the girls, and luckily I haven't had to talk about the parental experience that much because it frightens me.
I gotta say, I mean, I also don't know what it's like. I mean, I'm now a step parent, so that's a very different experience in general. But a lot of I was thinking about my relationship to my mother, and while obviously I'm very different than the characters in your book, I don't have their exact experiences. Aspects of that really reminded me of when I was young and like my relationship to my mom. So to me, it felt kind of natural.
Yeah.
Some of the like that was so mean when she's like, "No, my other family's better," and I'm just like, "Oh my god!" Like the most cruelest thing you could say to a parent. Like,
That felt like
and I
something I
know
might
I
have said
said
at
that.
some point.
Oh, I 100% did when I was young. I definitely told my mom I hate her and I hope she dies. Like I 100% said that. I regret it. If my mom ever hears this, just so you know, I love you, Mom. But when you're a kid, like, you don't realize your words are like knives right to the heart.
Yeah.
So be nice to your parents.
Yeah, I think
unless they're mean, but yeah.
I think J.M. Barrie says it in Peter Pan that children are heartless, and that's sort of something that really sunk into my soul. I love that book so much. So I think that's there is that. I think that's what I was sort of trying to explore as well, is that when you're young, you don't really have the concept of how you affect the world around you because you're still learning it. You're learning the dimensions. So with Canna and Lily, they're getting to that stage where they're starting to see the effects around them, and oh, cute.
He wants to be held. There's nothing to be done about it.
I encourage that. So I think they're starting to understand how their feelings are affecting other people as well, and I think both of them are reticent to talk about their experiences, but they're getting to that age where they're like, oh, actually we have to communicate this. That's the relationship. I hadn't quite learned that yet because it felt so deeply personal and it was just happening to me, but it's happening to everyone around me. So it's that opening of your thoughts. And I think that was such a big moment for me with my parents when I started to see them more as fallible human beings rather than people to just kind of push up against sometimes or get along with at other times, and just being completely separate from me and sort of all-knowing in some way. It's like, oh, actually this is very much a two-way street, and I think that's something that I really wanted to explore.
That 100%, the idea that as you grow up, hopefully part of what you learn is like your actions affect other people. Maybe not equally the same way, but anything we do has impacts on other people around us, and maybe that is a part of growing up.
And even things you can't control, like the shifting, it's like that's something that I'm doing, even though I haven't chosen to do it. So yeah, that's a big deal.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I love it.
From my perspective, the mother's point of view was one of the most enjoyable parts of the novel. I thought it worked tremendously well. I'm also not a parent, but in terms of familiarity
of non-parents talking about parenting.
Non-parents talking about it. It's from my own memories of, again, how parents get treated, or just observations of parents that I make. It's essential to the novel. Like, I can't imagine a novel without that perspective in it, of the mothers wrestling with the choices of how much do I get involved and push the daughters to kind of communicate with me and tell me how they're feeling, tell me what's happening to them, versus no, they've got to have their own freedom to come to that in their own time to maturity in it. But then also wrestling with the pain of having your offspring ripped away from you. And during the times where they're absent and not knowing if they're ever going to come back, like, you have to live your own life, but then you feel guilty about living your own life. And so I think even if the particular application to within the realms of motherhood might be outside of all of our perspectives here having this discussion, it's still analogous to very broad general things that humans generally face in terms of being in control with life, as opposed to being sort of managed by other people, or having other people that you're working with in terms of your decisions in life. And then also what one can do with their life versus the responsibilities or the things they feel that they need to put above themselves in their own lives. And so I found that very interesting and well done.
Thank you.
And also I loved how it was the complete opposite vibe, as you said, but also just the complete opposite, like, psychological perspective from everything in Face and the world of Face, because that was all about selfishness. This is all now about the utter reverse, about what can we do for other people in a way? Like, we're still worried about ourselves, but it's more than that. And that kind of concept is epitomized to me in the mother's role in the novel.
That's lovely to hear. I mean, the mothers were my favorite part to write. I really enjoyed those sections. I probably enjoyed writing Cynthia the most. I also felt like I probably identified with her the most as well. And I was trying to put some of myself in the mothers, regardless of my parenting. Yeah. But I just because there's still, I mean, a mother is just a person as well. So I kind of wanted to give her as true experience as I could. Well, both of them. Georgia's a much softer person, so she was quite an alien person to write, and that was fun in its own way. But yeah, their sections were the ones I got really excited about when I was coming to it. Whereas the girls, they were, yeah, I was always looking forward to getting through their sections so that I could write them others.
Did you find any danger of like favorites in terms of Kana versus Lily?
Yes, at first it was definitely skewed towards Kana, I think. And I was worried that I was making Lily too unlikable. And so I really worked hard to spend time with her and get to know her and get to like her. I think that her relationship with Ida really helps to soften her and make her more approachable to a reader, or at least to me as well. But yeah, I always knew how it was going to end. So yeah, so regardless of any favorites or anything, I knew pretty much what was
where it was going to go.
Did you have that very early in the writing process, the ending in mind, or did that kind of come out as you were thinking, well, you began writing and then thinking?
I began writing, I got maybe an eighth of the way through, and then I started thinking about the last page. And I usually have an idea about what the last page is going to look like, but I don't know the story. So it's really just like, this is the concept, these are the characters, that's the last moment. What am I trying to do here? And then it's filling in everything else.
So the Star Wars prequel method. We know that the end point of Anakin Skywalker. We just don't know how he got there yet.
Yeah. I do find that kind of structure really interesting.
It's got to be, I guess in novels it must be more fun. It's got to be more nerve-wracking to do in film, I imagine. I don't know why. It just seems like it's more terrifying.
It's a big risk, but it's, for me, I like it because there's just like such an element of discovery. You feel like an explorer really excavating all these people that have just cropped up out of nowhere. And what are they? What are their stories? Where did they come from? How did this happen?
Yeah, I suppose then you would describe yourself as, if you were to take the terms, a bit of a pantser.
Yeah, very much. Sort of, I think I've heard flashlight method as well, where you can see just a little way into the darkness, but nothing beyond what your light is shining on.
I like that one better than pantser. That's more fun to say.
Sort of
flashlight method.
Yeah, sort of. I heard that and I was like, oh, it's kind of like there are certain parts where I know there's a lit room further up ahead. It's just I don't know what's in between here and there.
That's like a horror novel waiting to happen.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of horror in everything that I write as well. I mean, I'm a big horror fan, so
you could definitely see aspects of that in Twice Lived and certainly in Phase.
I'm definitely trying to lean into it more in the next few that I'm doing. So
that's interesting. I'm very curious to see how a more horror-ish work from you would look.
Yes,
because
definitely.
I think for me, I think it was helped that I listened to the audiobook because the narrator, I think is Jessica Hales for Twice Lived, is like, I think she's got like a Yorkshire accent. I just love all that northern accent stuff.
I didn't even know there was an audiobook of Twice Lived.
Oh, Well, there is. And,
Yes.
I believe it's Jessica Hales, and she sounds suspiciously like Jodie Whittaker to me, just
Oh,
not
nice.
quite as
Yeah.
not quite as up there.
Yeah.
And I am a sucker for all of those northern accents, like
Yeah,
the
so am I,
Sheffield,
actually, yeah.
Yorkshire. Yeah, give me that stuff all day long, and I will. I mean, Jodie Whittaker could narrate audiobooks, and I'd
Oh,
listen to
yeah.
it all day.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, great voice.
But I think it really helped for me. I mean, I certainly would have got it in the book, but there's the way she reads was this really personal, like there was a lot of inflections in the voice. It felt like the characters were kind of speaking to me, which not all audiobooks do.
I've got to listen to it now.
It's very good. It's very good.
Now I'm curious.
But now I want to know what happens when you write a book that's a little bit more horror-like in this person's audio narration. Like, that'd be super interesting for me. So tell your publisher. Do it again.
Going to the horror of Face in some regards, it's much more overt horror dystopian. And ultimately, I mean, I guess the germ of the idea came to the idea or the concept of a destruction of intimacy in terms of destroying the ability to have actual physical touch between people, which is, hugely biologically important and psychologically important, but it sort of destroys that intimacy, right? Twice Lived, there's also a destruction of intimacy in that you're taking the girls from their families, and so it destroys that sort of familial intimacy, or at least threatens it. And then there's also, I mean, it begins, well, not the immediate beginning is with the mothers and the destruction of the intimacy between mother and, fetus inside. But then there's the destruction of the intimacy between Lily and the girl she falls in love with at first sight in a way, but then is torn from. And I love the character of Ada and sort of the emotional, spiritual support that she provides for Lily through the novel. But I guess my question is, are you interested just in general? Like, what is the origin of that interest that seems to be in the idea of the destruction of intimacy, whether it be the physical touch or the version in Twice Lived? And so where did that interest kind of come from?
I've never even considered them similar in that sense.
Okay.
My best friend's always like, "Oh, it's just real ace vibes from you." I think a lot of it is probably to do with how, I mean, again, going back to being third culture and moving around a lot, I've had many very close relationships that have just ended quite abruptly because I've moved, I've lost addresses, stuff like that. This is pre-internet when it was a lot harder to stay in touch with people. And and so you have these little heartbreaks that constantly come, and then after a time you start to get used to that and learn how to deal with it, but that doesn't make it less painful. You're just better at handling it, and it's a different kind of growing each time. And I think that with Face, that them learning, the ones that do learn to be intimate, like Skylar and Eduardo or someone like that, they're growing, whereas the people that are stuck in that funk of lack of intimacy, they're not growing. And in Twice Lived, I feel like it is a coming of age story for not just the girls, but for their parents as well, because you're consistently coming of age. It's just always different things that concern you at each age, and it's something that I'm feeling like at the moment in my late 30s. I'm really feeling like a new sort of beginning again, where life has changed dramatically around me, and I'm coming of age again. And so you never stop growing in those senses, and each time there's a sort of a falling back from intimacy and having to relearn how to be intimate as a new person, I guess. I don't know.
No, that makes
really
sense.
Thought of it that way.
Sometimes I start rambling about something and then I'm like, am I making any sense? Am I answering
No, it
question. I
makes
don't know.
no, it makes perfect sense to me.
I just had never thought of it that way. As you age and you hit these different periods in your life, there is a like an aspect of like I just hit 40 recently. Well, not that recently. Like I'm going to be 41 this year, so it's climbing. But definitely like hitting 40 is different than when I hit 30. And definitely way different than when I hit 20. Those different age groups, like things change and adjust, I suppose, as you age, and you have to sort of learn a different social culture to some degree.
Figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit fortunate that I know some people that are like younger, so I get to see what 20-year-olds are doing, and I'm also a teacher, so like I'm around 20-year-olds all the time. And so I like get to watch them be 20, but I'm not 20. I'm like the cool professor, but I'm an old man now. Well, I'm not really that old, but you get the
You start
idea.
to feel that way pretty quick, though, feeling old. I don't know, like I've got a lot of younger friends as well, and I'm like the old lady in the bunch.
Have they done the thing where they reference the 90s as the late 1900s?
Not to me, no.
I have not heard
but
that
I have heard about it on internet stuff anyways. Yeah.
When they do that to me, or they refer to like classic rock as like Nickelback or something, and I'm like, nothing against Nickelback, but I'm just thinking of like music from that era, like the late 90s and early 2000s. I just like shrivel up and die a little bit, because that's not classic rock to me. Classic rock is like 60s, 70s. Like, it's
well, the 80s and 90s, the oldies station was playing 50s music, so effectively all those classic rock stations are the oldies stations.
It is a very weird experience, to say the least. Yeah. But I guess that's part of what you discover, right? Is as you age, the cultural touchstones that you have, a lot of those still matter to you, but they don't necessarily matter to younger audience. Some of them do. Like Gremlins, weirdly, is still relevant, even though that's an 80s film.
Yeah,
but
actually,
I hear young people mention it.
The other day, a friend of my husband's at his work, we found out that she'd never seen The Matrix, and she'd been born right after I think it had come out. So we a bunch of us, we had her over. We had like a big night of it so that she could watch The Matrix, because it was kind of like how like it's such like a big part of like how culture has got. And it was interesting watching her watch it, because obviously all the blue pill, red pill stuff that's on internet culture and black pill stuff, like she was suddenly finally seeing for the first time where it was born, like, and that was just kind of like mind-blowing as she was watching it, because she had this whole other cultural texture to relate or to overlay on it than we had when we saw it, because for us it was brand new, it hadn't affected the world yet. So that was like a real interesting experience.
That is always interesting when you do give like a younger audience something like that has had such obvious impact on the world we live in, and then have them go, oh, so that's where that came from. It's like, yeah,
that's right.
Like, you mean all those movies having people go, ah, like doing that thing? Like, yeah, that's bullet time. You can thank The Matrix. Like, oh, and they're like, oh, it's wild. Like, I'm curious what in 20 years, what after the Fast and Furious franchise ends, like, what is the impact in 20 years? Because that franchise
is huge.
It's
gonna end?
Oh god, no, it'll keep going. Vin Diesel will be like, 95 years old and still going family, like every time. But supposedly they're ending it.
Only the cars change,
only the cars. I guess. Yeah, they'll be flying in 20 years.
They'll be flying cars, yeah.
It's interesting looking at cinema at the moment and thinking what is actually going to be that landmark piece of new breakthrough art. I think there's a big case to be made for Across the Spider-Verse, maybe. That feels really fresh and different to me in terms of art and style and what they were doing with that.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, I mean, there's some real interesting experimentation in cinema at the moment. So
yeah, it'll be interesting.
The hard thing in terms of...
Go ahead. Sorry, Dan.
The hard thing from shared experience is, at least from when I try to ask students about things, even recent things, it's very fragmentary of whether, because all entertainment is so fragmentary now between streaming services. you have large swaths of students that are like, oh, I never saw that. Or, they'll get angry because I'll reference something or make an analogy in class. And they're like, well, that's not fair. I can't afford to get, that channel. Why are you using that analogy that other people can understand and I can't?
Yeah.
And so, like, there starts getting pushback. So I'm like, okay, I just won't make anything fun in class, right? And in terms of, like, give you any analogies, it'll just be because I don't know as there's much of a shared experience anymore
there aren't
in terms of
events, like shared
entertainment.
events the way they used to be, like where there was one TV show that everyone was watching because that was what was on the 5 channels we had. And you would wait every week for that episode, and then you would have your water cooler conversations about that. So there was these generations that really built shared memories from culture, which that sort of identity is kind of dissipating. Like, it's interesting. I wonder. I want to see where it's going. I mean, I'm seeing a rise of people getting interested in material products again.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
So I wonder if there is a pushback towards that, and people are trying to like pull things back into a more community kind of oriented way of looking at these things. But it's hard to tell.
It is hard to say.
Yeah. You never know.
Now especially feels hard to predict because I was thinking I teach a social media class and we talk about memes, but the way memes work now in our culture, most of them are, the same memes might be shared, over and over and over, like within a specific small group, but like most memes have a very short life cycle. And so they might be relevant for like a month or even a couple of weeks and then disappear. And so there's this constant cycling of different references. And so I wonder if on some level that's going to be an impact too, where there aren't as many cultural touchstones because they're all constantly cycling so much.
Right.
It just memes in general, like even a meme that is big and sticks around for several years may eventually just be superseded by another one. And is that going to have the same impact as, say, like, in the 1970s when Star Wars comes out and has like a gigantic impact on, at least in Western culture?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not a futurist. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm always quite impressed with futurists and the way that they can extrapolate things or sort of at least guess, having the confidence to guess as well. That's like the thing that really gets me. But I mean, I feel like things can't keep speeding up the way that there has to be an end point. Like it can't support itself indefinitely.
Yeah, like it'll spin out of control and then
like I feel like there
back.
has to be, I mean, because technology's adapting really fast, but people aren't. Like we're still kind of dealing with the same hulking, clumsy structure that we've had for like our brains haven't evolved that much. We've just got this technology that's evolved. So I think it's really hard to see how the tech is changing us or how we're going to start resisting that in some way, because I feel like there is some kind of resistance in little enclaves.
Or we hook our brains up to machines and expand our memory so we can. We're just giant machine brains and we're just like running around with little things to hold our heads up.
Have you ever read a book called Engine Summer?
No.
I can't remember the author's name now, but
John Crowley.
Yeah, that has a really interesting look at kind of, because it's like a post-apocalyptic world, but the twists are quite interesting towards the end, and it has it has a really, it feels quite a plausible kind of future to me, even though it's very sort of not really set in our world with our technology, but the sort of ideas feel kind of plausible. So yeah, I kind of recommend that. I read it a very long time ago though, and I was much younger, so I was probably green every reason and not really. I was just like, wow.
Well, it did come out in 1979, so
wow,
yeah,
as old as me.
I
not
do
a long
love
book.
Sci-fi.
Yeah.
I think I'd seen a review that said something about Face being a kind of throwback to that sort of era of science fiction, and I would say that that's probably because I read that kind of science fiction more than I have contemporary science fiction. So there is a slight old-fashioned bent to the way that I approach my stories.
Well, that's the era of like new wave and the influx of social science fiction as being a
Mm.
major mode.
Right. Look,
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that does
Yeah.
make sense. Although I wouldn't say that your work reads like somebody on LSD, which I think is
Give me
fine.
time.
Yeah, that is like one of the influences from that period is like people that write, but it sounds like they're on drugs,
Mm.
which is fine. I mean, I enjoy it quite a lot. I like weird stuff, but some of them actually were using drugs, which I don't recommend.
Maybe
So,
write on drugs, edit sober. I think that's always the thing people forget is the editing sober.
ooh, but what happens if you don't understand what you were like? You get sober and you're like, whoa, what the hell was I doing?
Which is which? What did I write?
Yeah, yeah.
Then I think that you've got a problem with your text.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it needs to be. Well, I mean, this is like the Philip K. Dick problem because sometimes he
Yeah.
writes philosophy, and you're like, "Are are you in the same universe we're in? Like, what are you talking?" I love Philip K. Dick, just to be clear, but he is at times uh fascinating because he sounds bananas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I find some of his work kind of a stiff door. It's
yeah,
hard to open and get in there. But Androids is one of my favorite books. Like that one, I just really sank into. I've read it several times, and yeah, it felt just like it really blew my mind when I read it.
yeah. That one and Ubik for me,
Hmm.
really,
I haven't
really.
read it yet, but
Oh, it's so weird. It's so weird. It's normal Philip K. Dick weird, like do androids dream weird,
Hmm.
not like
Okay, yeah,
yeah, not like a Deus Irae, which I probably said that incorrectly, which like has a character who like doesn't have legs and like moves around on a like board with wheels and is like going on a religious mission. It's been a while since I've read it, and it's just sitting. The more I think about it, I just think like, phew, if you tried to write this today, like you would get roasted alive because he's definitely not terribly sensitive to like people
yeah.
with disabilities in this book. It's bizarre. Anyway,
I
Philip.
mean, yeah, quite a lot of that old sci-fi. I remember reading The Demolished Man, Alfred
Oh,
Bester, and man, that book, I adored it, but he really had a bad problem presenting women for sure. And there's a lot of gross, icky things in it, but the book is so good that you
yeah.
kind of just have to just be like, well, whatever.
The Space Merchants has a similar thing a little bit earlier, which is Frederick Paul and Cornbooth, if I'm correct. But there is some degree to which like it's very much about like 1950s advertising culture. So it's like it's basically
Mm,
like imagine Mad Men, but science
yeah.
fictional and in space. So of course women get not a terribly great presentation.
Mm, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
it feels more appropriate for that book because it doesn't feel like it's trying to be mean to women, but that might be my interpretation. I
Yeah.
don't know. Maybe I'll go back to it. But in any case, we have rambled. I love books. What can I
Yeah,
tell
I
you?
was just gonna say, as soon as you start talking about books, I don't stop.
It's hard to stop. There's so many
Yeah,
good books.
that's true.
Um, so I think we kind of have to wind down, which sucks,
Okay.
but you have a life and we don't, but you know, we
I
can't
mean,
just
I've
keep you
got a
here.
free Saturday afternoon. I'm not really doing much. So.
Okay, 6 hour episode. Here we go. No. um, but okay, so you had suggested there is more work coming, but I don't know if you're allowed to say anything about it. So one of our questions is like, what are you kind of working on next? Naturally, that comes with the like
Yeah.
that you're allowed to tell us about, of course.
No one's told me I'm not allowed to say anything yet. So, like, if they start telling me after the fact, then that's on them for not telling me before. Um, so, I've got a book out on sub at the moment. So, I'm hoping a publisher is going to pick it up. And that's, again, my trademark of lots of different perspectives. Most of it's taking place inside an author's head. She's dying, and the characters that she hasn't put in stories yet are trying to find a way to get out of her head before she dies.
Ooh.
So it's very meta, looking at creation, storytelling, arts, how that is impacted by health and vice versa, that kind of thing.
Okay, I want this.
Very cool.
So that, and what I've been trying to do with that is to really play with the form as much as possible. So I'm really trying to be inventive with the way that I have made the book look and the way that I've played with text, things like that. So hopefully it'll be picked up, and then hopefully it'll be an exciting read. I feel like it's one of those books that will probably have to be read as an actual book because there's a lot of moving parts in it. And I'm currently working on a first draft of my more horror novel. I think it's like basically everything is getting a bit more horror like elements in it. But again, it's very kitchen sink, domestic, more sort of anxieties around parenting as well. So it seems like that sort of intimacy and idea is still strong with me. It's trending with me.
Yes.
It's awesome.
So yeah.
That sounds great.
So those are the two things that I'm working on at the moment.
Daniel, you're next, and I'm giving you the last question.
Oh.
I'm being nice to you.
All right. Wow. So it feels so odd. Now, where can folks find you, Joma?
I am still on Twitter from my sins, or X as they like to call it. Other than that, I don't really have much of a social media presence. Yeah. So that's how people can contact me if they want to get in touch. And yeah, the books are available at any good bookstore, I guess.
Yeah, you can find them many, many places.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
really sure what's happening with Wild because the publisher's gone under. So I'm not really sure. Like, I think there's still copies floating around, but that's by the by.
Yeah, well, maybe it'll come out in a new edition one day.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show. This was a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
It's been really lovely, and you've asked such interesting questions. I definitely wasn't prepared.
Oh, you were fine.
I'm sorry. You're great.
No. Don't apologize. It was really great. I had a great time.
Thank you. So for folks at home, you can find us in all the places. We're Skiffy Fanty on pretty much everywhere that except X. We're not on there anymore because Elon Musk doesn't like us. But you can find all of those links at our link tree, which is linktr.ee/SkiffyandFanty. We're basically everywhere, Blue Sky, blah, blah, blah. If you have thoughts about this episode, or you want to suggest a topic for us to cover, or there's an author you want us to have on, whatever, there are two places you can go, skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, or you can send us an email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. There's a Patreon as well, which is just patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. So please support us if you like, or at least tell people that we exist. I am on lots of places. Best place to find me would be my link tree, which is just /Sean Duke. I am also on this channel, which is Alphabet Streams, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. Then Skiffy does all of its live shows at 6:30 p.m. Central on Fridays. So you can find me at all of those lovely.
You can find me on Blue Sky at Reading 1000 Lives. That's 1000. And you can read my reviews on Skiffy and Fanty blog, on reading1000lives.com, and many other places as well.
How close are we to 1000?
We are fast approaching 1000. We're at.
Okay, could you? Yeah. Get like a
Can
I
get a running tally? I should actually calculate it, like an actual real calculation.
Yeah,
we'll see.
You should.
But then what am I going to do once I reach 1000?
You change it to Reading 2000 Lives.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just keep going up. Umberto Eco read he probably didn't read anything in his library because that library had 15,000 books in it, but still. He just left people with this like massive library of books.
I still haven't read any of Echo's books either.
Yes, exactly.
He's an interesting writer, but I wouldn't say he is my favorite, but nothing against him. It's just, he is definitely.
I watched the movie of The Neighbors. I feel like that's enough for me. I enjoyed
That's
that
enough.
film a lot, actually.
Yeah. Great. Well, okay, I got to make it
Okay.
awkward. This is part of the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws. So I have been working with Daniel, and Daniel knows very much about this, that we're developing a microbe that can transport us to alternate dimensions. But in transporting us across dimensions, we become sentient, hive-minded bacterial cultures that eat only steel. So this other parallel universe is really struggling right now because we keep eating their skyscrapers.
We could do that story too. I mean, there are microbes that do that, so
I made that up. I didn't even know that was real. What?
Yeah.
Okay.
Microbes will eat anything. They've evolved to eat anything you give them. So
you're telling me you could have giant blooms of hive-minded microbial life that could eat skyscrapers?
yes.
Are they working on that for maybe eating plastic in the oceans and stuff?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, they're like at a plastic recycling facility. They've isolated bacteria that can break down plastics.
That's cool.
The particular complex structures. The big thing is, just getting enough of them to really be able to break down the PET, the PET, whatever that stands for. That makes up a lot of types of plastics that are slow to degrade.
I thought this was going to be awkward, but really it just became educational.
Yes.
So I guess this is an educational ending and scene.
Microbes are just always awkward, so.
If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.